Thank you very much, Bill, for that nice introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be at the Wahlberg, as it were. So, in this talk, I should like to address what might seem to be a straightforward question. How does the spectator apprehend a figure or bust in marble as a representation? Or to put it in another way, how do marble figures or busts, especially those from the 18th century, and that's what I'm afraid going to be concentrating on, but there's much else besides, work as representations? All right, there we are. Two examples, Houdon's bust of Diderot and Roubiliac's statue of Handel. Although such questions underlie much of what has been written about the history of figurative sculpture, historians of sculpture have tended to engage with them only obliquely. Within recent years, however, those concerned with the history of sculpture, both academics and curators, have become increasingly interested in how figurative sculpture works. I'm thinking here of the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition Like Life and the writings of scholars that include Alex Potts, Joris van Gastel, James Hall, Caroline van Eck and Michael Cole. How do we relate what we see in figurative sculpture to our experience of viewing the human figure? And how is the material of marble involved in this transaction between viewer and sculpture? In addressing these issues, a useful starting point is the debate about visual representation prompted by the publication of Ernst Gombrich's Art and Illusion in 1960, and various Wahlberg figures will figure prominently in what follows. Although concerned, of course, with pictorial representations, the arguments raised in this fundamental text, and even more so in the critiques made of Gombrich's arguments by others, can, I suggest, be useful in considering the problem of sculptural representation. One of Gombrich's key points, grounded in what was then current thinking about visual perception, is that there is no innocent eye, and that viewing involves a process of making and matching. He used Constable's Wivenhoe Park, an analysis of this, to explore this. This process of applying conceptual schemata, part of a mental set, and then correcting these, is, he argues, fundamental for an understanding of both perception and representation, as far as both artist and beholder are concerned. In this way, he explores the nature of both perception and representation, and in the process engages with, in Nelson Goodman's words, quote, the problem of reconciling the objectivity of representation with its conventionality and the relativity of vision, unquote. While recent accounts of visual perception challenge the empirical evidence employed by Gombrich, the points made in Art and Illusion about the use of schemata continue to resonate in discussions of representation. So too do his ideas about the beholder's share and the way in which the viewing of paintings involved expectations and projections. More problematic, however, is his assertion that it is not possible to view what is represented together with the surface of that representation. Here he used the familiar example of the rabbit or duck image. Michael Podrow, another Wahlberg figure, has succinctly summarized Gombrich's central argument as involving two component theses. To quote Podrow, the first thesis is that in pictures, when we are aware of the subject, we are forced to neglect the painted surface as such. And the second is that we are unable to discern within our experience the border between the surface and the subject. We cannot observe when one turns into the other. That's Podrow. I'll return to this argument and the challenges to it in a moment. But first, I should note the substantial critiques of other aspects of Gombrich's study. Soon after the book's appearance, the philosopher Nelson Goodman questioned the way in which Gombrich's account of representation relied on, quote, the degree of sameness of information provided by picture and subject, unquote. That is, informational content that is independent of visual schemata. In Goodman's view, having exorcised the devil of the correspondence theory of representation, Gombrich is adrift on the deep blue sea of coherence theory. Unquote. In his book, Languages of Art, Goodman proposes an alternative interpretation in which representation and resemblance should be seen as unconnected. Instead, he argues that denotation was at the core of a representation, but this remains independent of resemblance. Another challenge was mounted by Norman Bryson. Bryson acknowledges that how Gombrich's notion of a schema, which undergoes constant correction, the making and matching process, challenges assumptions about what he calls the essential copy and the conventional Plinian account of a progressive history of art. But he nonetheless sees Gombrich's work as amounting to, quote, a transitional aesthetics that recognizes but cannot theorize in depth the material nature of the painterly sign, unquote. Bryson here brings out a contradiction in Gombrich's overarching argument, but I think slightly misrepresents his position. Gombrich was not so much, despite his denials, reiterating a history of art that was progressive, as Bryson asserts, but rather, as Christopher Wood has articulated, he was seeing the history of art as a process of learning that is a convergent one without an endpoint. But as far as my initial questions are concerned, the most relevant critique of Gombrich's central argument was that put forward by Richard Wollheim. Wollheim challenged Gombrich's rabbit or duck-based theory of representation, or what he described as the seeing canvas stroke seeing nature disjunction. Instead, Wollheim proposes what he calls twofoldness. This is a key idea. This involves the process of seeing in, a process in which representation is grounded and essential to effects of naturalism. For Wollheim, seeing in has two aspects. One is the recognitional aspect, by which we discern something in the marked surface of a painting. The other is the configurational aspect, involving our awareness of the marked surface as such. For Wollheim, these two aspects are interlinked and reciprocal. Central to his notion of twofoldness, there are two aspects. These are two aspects of what he calls representational seeing, a mode of seeing that differs from seeing objects. Indeed, in arguing for his twofoldness thesis, Wollheim was responding to what he saw as Gombrich's, quote, failure to assign to the seeing appropriate to representations a distinctive phenomenology that impels him towards the view that there is nothing distinctive about the seeing of representations, unquote. The same process is rather differently described by Podrow. For Podrow, quote, we not only pursue the subject through the medium, but at the same time utilize the subject in the cause of the imaginative project of depiction. In this way, we are led to reflect on and reimagine the transition between the actuality of the medium and the represented subject, and are invited both to attend to and imagine away the distinction between real and fictive. So what about sculpture? Unsurprisingly, sculpture makes only a few fleeting appearances in Gombrich's study, nor have Gombrich's critics paid much attention to sculpture. While Wollheim saw the challenge, remarking that the most difficult problem of all is how we perceive sculpture, unquote, he did not take it up, But having outlined some fault lines within the debates prompted by Gombrich's book, I should like to ask how we might make use of some of these arguments to develop an interpretative framework for thinking about sculptures as representations. And then I'll go on to ask about marble as a material and how this might be understood in terms of sculptural representation. And finally, I shall look at some 18th century marble sculptures and ask how they were apprehended by the spectator as representations. To what extent and in what ways do we perceive a marble sculpture as a representation? And in what ways is this process close to, though not the same, as looking at a painting? The most obvious similarity, of course, is to be found in relief sculpture. While the relationship between relief sculpture and painting is a central topic in discussions of the Paragone, the way in which reliefs are apprehended by the beholder has not been so explicitly considered. This issue is, however, directly addressed by Podro in his subtle analysis of Donatello's ascension and Christ giving the keys to St. Peter, attending in particular to the notion of the plane of the surface and, quote, the continuity of a surface through the array of discrete objects represented on it. Podro comments that sculpture has such a surface only insofar as we can imagine. In Donatello's reliefs, including this example, we can trace a consistent preoccupation with reworking the boundaries between the material of his media and the fictions of his subject matter. For the beholder, this means negotiating between what is represented on the one hand and on the other hand, the medium of marble employed in the representation. Or, to put it in Wollheim's terms of twofoldness, moving between the recognitional aspect and the configurational aspect. But how might this work in the case of a freestanding two-dimensional figure in marble? And to what extent might such a figure be viewed in the same terms as a pictorial representation or indeed a marble relief? Discussions which touch on these questions, including those by Podro and still more recently by Alex Potts, have had to engage with the still influential account of the making and viewing of sculpture by Adolf von Hildebrand in his The Problem of Form in Figurative Art. For Hildebrand, it was necessary to give a three-dimensional sculpture a pictorial clearness of form by ensuring that it be viewed from a principal vantage point. As Hildebrand put it, a long quotation from Hildebrand, the planes in which the natural solidity of the figure reduces make up an imaginary space having a clear-cut form, a rectangle of greater or lesser depth. Whenever this is not the case, the unitary pictorial effect of the figure is lost. A tendency is then felt to clarify what we cannot perceive from the present point of view by a change of position. Thus, we are driven all round the figure without ever being able to grasp it in its entirety. Not a hairbreadth advance has been made through representing the object in a work of art. It might as well have been left a piece of nature. The purpose of sculpture is not to put the spectator in a haphazard and troubled state regarding the three-dimensional or cubic aspect of things, leaving him to do the best he may in forming his visual ideas. The real aim is to give him a perfectly clear visual idea and thus remove the disturbing problem of cubic form. So that's Hildebrand. As Potts has recognised, Hildebrand's account implicitly acknowledges that, in Potts's words, quote, a sculpture consists itself as a thing to be viewed by way of some kind of framing or staging of its situation to the viewer. Staging and framing are certainly conditions which determine how a three-dimensional figurative sculpture is viewed. In some cases, the effects of distancing and control are very explicit, as was the case with Canova's Three Graces in its setting in the Temple of the Graces at one end of the sculpture gallery at Woburn. And in other cases, the composition of a sculpture assumes a limited range of viewpoints and indeed controls the movement and viewing of the spectator. This may be seen in Michael Erhardt's Virgin of Mercy, where the sculpture itself commands what Michael Baxendale has nicely described as its arc of address. But what of sculptures which do not follow Hildebrand's protocols and do not assume viewing that comes as close as possible to that expected of a two-dimensional image? If the setting is a less controlled one and a sculpture can be viewed from a multiplicity of positions, how is such a sculpture apprehended? Of course, as the spectator pauses, he or she will be viewing the figure as an outline. And while, as Podro has pointed out, quote, sculpture has no overall surface coinciding with a plane, a figure might be read as a series of varying imaginative surface planes. Here, Hans Kaufmann's description of Donatello's St. George is cited by Podro as an interpretation grounded in Hildebrandian principles. In Kaufmann's words, despite the spatial gaps which separate the parts from each other and require us to imagine them together, the frontal aspect is enclosed in a closely bounded coherence in the plane. One form rests against another without intervening spaces. No breaks disrupt the surface. All forms are extended in the plane and treated as in a relief. The trunk is more extended than rounded, and the left lower arm as if flattened, so that we are hardly aware of planes receding inwards. No parts protrude into depth or outward beyond the coherence of the plane. So that's Kaufmann. Donatello's figure is, of course, placed in a niche and so literally framed, as well as having its apprehension by the viewer controlled by the height at which it was set. In other cases, where the setting is more open, the spectator's response involves more than the visual alone. Here, the way in which a sculpture is read depends on the way in which that sculpture and the spectator share a common space, and the response is as much a somatic one as a purely visual one. This has been explored by Alex Potts in The Sculptural Imagination. Although primarily concerned with developments in 20th century sculpture, Potts' study of how, quote, the structuring of a sculptural work is partly defined through the viewer's physical encounter with it and cannot be entirely located in its form, unquote, has significant implications for how we think about the apprehension of earlier sculpture. Potts remarks, for instance, on how the, quote, sustained viewing of a freestanding sculpture not only dissipates the fixed image because of the different aspects it presents from different angles, and how the kinesthetic viewing activated by three-dimensional work brings with it a heightened sense of temporality, unquote. Such comments have a resonance as we consider an 18th century marble figure and think about both its relationship to the spectator and its agency within that spectator's space. In this way, the apprehension of a freestanding marble figure involves more than is assumed in either Gombrich's or Wollheim's theories of viewing a two-dimensional image. And I should add that the somatic, of course, might also, of course, very much include the haptic, something I'm not exploring very fully here. A spectator's response, whether visual or somatic, to such a figurative marble sculpture, crucially involves a recognition that the figure is a representation. Apprehending, and I use this word because it assumes more than just viewing, a freestanding figure is different from seeing or encountering any other three-dimensional object. At the same time, the spectator has to engage with the figure's materiality and physical presence. Here then, Wollheim's notion of twofoldness is given an extra twist. Seeing the work as being executed in marble heightens the tension, a reciprocal and productive one, between the recognition of an image on the one hand and the acknowledgement of the sculpture's materiality on the other, so between the work's recognitional and configurational aspects. Sculpture, and especially sculpture in marble, also prompts us to think differently about other voices in the debate around Gombrich's work. For example, in arguing that representation does not necessarily involve resemblance, Nelson Goodman has remarked that pictures far more closely resemble other pictures than the subject they represent. Likewise, a marble statue more closely resembles other statues than the living figure it is supposed to represent. In some cases, the material qualities of a sculpture can play an overt part in the way in which a figure is perceived as a representation. For example, Balthasar Permoser's Christ at the Column. Here, the red-veined Salzburg marble is employed to simulate, or at least suggest, the blood running down the flesh of the flagellated Christ, merging the material features of the sculpture with what the sculpture represents. More often, however, white statuary marble has a distancing effect. Certainly, the spectator might apprehend the sculptural image as more real, in the sense that the frame containing and isolating the image, in the case of a picture, has been removed. Spectator and image occupy the same shared three-dimensional space. But at the same time, the spectator has to engage with the difference between flesh and marble. Now, all this, of course, is very obvious. But picking up on Wollheim's twofoldness notion, I'm interested here in how the spectator is prompted to negotiate between a belief in the illusionistic effects created by the way the marble is carved, and at the same time, an acknowledgement of the material qualities of the marble. This acknowledgement of the marble's materiality might well involve reading the marks made upon it as registers or traces of the process of making, so prompting the spectator to reenact that process imaginatively. Another way to put this is to say that the spectator is acknowledging the agency of the marble. Anthropologists such as Tim Ingold and Lambros Maleforis have seen making not in terms of a process of hylomorphism, by which a natural material is shaped by culture, but rather as a process of growth in which maker and material work in collaboration. By attending to the material features of a marble figure, the spectator, as a vicarious maker, is recognizing and engaging with the material as an active agent. What is being set in play here is a dynamic in which a belief in the illusionistic effect of the sculpture, its realness, whether as a figure occupying a space shared with the viewer or as a work with different, often contrasting surfaces supposedly simulating other materials, is placed in tension with an awareness of the medium or material through which this illusionistic effect is created. Nowhere is this tension more in evidence than in some marble sculptures executed in the 18th century. And there are reasons for this, I think. One genre which we can explore, one genre through which we can explore how representation and marble work during this period is the portrait bust. What concerns me here is how we might make use of the writings of Gombrich and his critics to explore how the portrait bust was perceived as a representation. And how might we use this debate to make sense of the relationship between marble and representation here? Take two busts by Houdon. Firstly, the rather grand bust of Madame de Vermenoux. Approaching this bust as a representation of the sitter, We are initially struck by its pose, with the head raised and turned to one side, so as to suggest movement. Not only movement that has happened, but also the possibility of future movement, endowing what is a static image with the suggestion of temporality, topic that's been recently addressed by both Alex Potts and Michael Cole using different examples. Moving closer, the spectator becomes aware of the distinction between the carving of the various surfaces. Or to put it in terms of how we perceive these as representation, the difference in texture between the simulated details of lace, satin, flesh, and hair. In particular, there is the contrast between the smooth polish of the face and the carving of the hair, the latter with the chisel marks left visible. The spectator's reading of the illusionistic effects achieved through the worked marble surfaces might be understood in Wollheim's terms as the sculpture's recognitional aspect. However, that spectator is at the same time, and it is a reciprocal process, engaging in the configurational aspect through an awareness of the bust as a material artifact carved in marble. Here then we see a contrast being drawn between the momentary effects associated with the illusionistic nature of the representation and the association of permanence carried by the material. Reading the image as a living figure is being kept in tension with a recognition of the bust as an object. The point at which this tension cannot be maintained, of course, is around the truncation. That feature of a bust format where the sharing of a single space by the represented image and the spectator becomes an evident fiction. Here, the truncation of the bust marks the separation between the illusionistic field and the material nature of the marble. But in this case, Houdon plays on the spectator's awareness of the genre and its conventions, and more to the point of this fiction, by continuing the drapery, one of the bust's illusionistic devices, around the socle, the most obviously artificial and unnaturalistic element of the bust. The sculptor at one and the same time obscures the socle and draws attention to it, so engaging that spectator in the fiction of the illusion and at the same time in a knowing acknowledgement of the artificiality of the format. No such devices are employed by Houdon in his bust of Diderot. Here, depiction of the sitter as a figure coexisting in the same space as the spectator is sustained by features such as the set of the head, the open mouth, the surfaces of the simulated skin with its wrinkles, and above all, by the eyes. But the way in which the spectator registers the bust as a representation is determined by that spectator's physical relationship with the bust, by not seeing it from afar, but rather confronting it, as it were, face to face. 18th century viewers were well aware of this, as the brief entry for bust in the Encyclopédie reveals. A note following the entry proper raises two questions. The first question concerns what is included, head, shoulders, etc., and what is not, adding that the spectator is reminded of a surgical amputation or even an execution. The second question asks by what rule the format of the bust was determined, answering this by suggesting that the area shown was calculated naturally in that, quote, the extent of the parts included corresponds to the area covered by the eye at that distance where something can be seen properly, unquote. While it is presented in terms of how the format of the bust was ideated, this statement at the same time anticipates how a bust might be apprehended by the spectator. In the process, it assumes a relationship between the place of the viewer's body in relationship to the bust, suggesting not viewing from afar, but something more direct and even intimate. In this way, it implies a relationship between the viewing of a person face to face and the viewing of a portrait bust. The dual appreciation of the bust of Diderot as both an illusionistic visual representation and as an actual carved object, its twofoldness, involves a perceptual play that gives the work its visual and aesthetic interest. Viewing a marble portrait such as this involves the spectator in a process of oscillation, an active viewing that simultaneously engages with the image as a face or head, sharing a space with that spectator, and also takes account of that image as a material artifact with characteristics, most obviously its monochrome features, which distinguish it from the head that is represented. Now, this rather obvious point applies to sculpted portraits of any period, but how this oscillation works becomes, I think, especially interesting in the case of some of the most striking portrait busts from mid-18th century France and Britain. Busts by sculptors such as Pigalle, Roubiliac, or Houdon have subtly nuanced surfaces and notably animated features that suggest a degree of illusionism more familiar in painted portraits. The way in which the surfaces of these sculpted portraits are carved suggest ephemeral effects which are at odds with the timelessness associated with marble. What Byron was referring to in his comment about the portrait bust having pretensions to permanency. Happy phrase that. Confronting an image such as Roubiliac's Earl of Chesterfield and giving it close and sustained attention, the spectator engages at one and the same time with an illusionistic representation of a head within his or her own space and a white marble sculpture that is a piece of virtuoso carving. This is an image that is at once animate yet poised. Chesterfield's alertness of expression seems to be matched and enhanced by the firmness of the musculature and bone structure articulated on the bare chest. The seeming transparency of the portrait prompts us to experience the encounter as one of directness and almost intimacy, aided and encouraged by the bust's somatic legibility. Yet at the same time, our eye moves across the finely modulated surface of the chest and up to the less finished strands of hair with their traces of the chisel, consciously registering and vicariously reenacting the carving of the marble, while at the same time engaging with the fiction of a person-to-person encounter. The veristic qualities of face and torso, with the unevenness of the shoulders and the twist of the sitter's right side towards us, seem enhanced rather than negated by the artificiality of the truncation. The body sliced away at the start of the upper arms and its concave curve continued and doubled by the socle. What we are engaging with here is manifestly an artifact, a made object. The oscillation involved here was something very much played on by sculptors at a time when sculptural portraits were becoming more ambitiously illusionistic. The viewing of sculpture in this way was also very much informed by contemporary discussion about the way perception worked. This discussion was grounded, of course, in John Locke's chapters on perception in an essay concerning human understanding and a widespread contemporary familiarity with Lockean ideas about sensation and perception. Locke is indeed invoked in a much-cited chapter from Michael Baxendall's Patterns of Intention, the Warburg figure, a chapter about Chardin's taking tea. Baxendall suggests that the viewing of Chardin's painting might be understood within a context of what he described as vulgar Lockeanism. For Baxendorf, Chardin and Locke seem to, quote, share a distinct sort of perceptual nervousness and self-consciousness, an awareness of the complexity and even fragility of the act of perception. Linked with this is a series of shifts in thinking about perception in general that directed many people's minds towards the subject in perception, towards the perceiver. Baxendorf goes on to argue that Chardin's painting offers, quote, the product of sustained perception in the guise of a glance or two's sensation, and keeps the beholder on his toes by teasing him between one point of fixation and another. The result is a work that is an enacted record of attention, which we ourselves summarily reenact. And the same might be said of the portrait busts I have mentioned. One characteristic of such portraits, when executed in marble, is the way in which they combine apparently momentary effects suggested by the carving of drapery or the accidents of physical appearance, with an assertion of the materiality of the marble itself. It is as if for the ephemeral, what is perceived as the play of light on a configuration of folds or change in the shape of the surface of the skin, that might change, something that might change at any moment, is kept in tension with the timeless, enduring quality of both the work's material and the associations of the genre. Temporality is very much in play here, but my main point is that the carving of such busts and statues, so as to prompt viewing of this sort, assumes close and sustained attention on the part of the viewer. By giving the work such attention, the viewer is being teased. The ambiguity of the mimetic effect is such that material and effect, immediacy and stasis assume the participation of the viewer in a perceptual game. This with the conventions of the genre assumes a consciousness on the part of both viewer and sculptor as to how perception works, as well as an awareness by both of the artificial nature of the bust. And by employing it, by employing or responding to enhanced effects of animation and ephemerality through the treatment of sculptural surfaces, both sculptor and spectator were also taking account of developing ideas about how faces were viewed, the refinement of familiar theories of physiognomy, as well as arguments, most notably those made by David Hume, of the composite nature of character. Of course, many of the qualities of 18th century sculpture I have highlighted, including a recognition on the part of the viewer of the duality of sculpture, were central to how, say, a 17th century viewer might have apprehended the mimetic effects of a bust by Bernini. But it is in the 18th century that this fundamental ambiguity, the oscillation prompted by the viewing of illusionistic busts, becomes more explicitly acknowledged in aesthetic theory and is understood in terms of a consciousness about how perception works. As Jacqueline Lichtenstein has explored, writers such as Diderot, Marmontel, Abbé Dubois, and Quatremer de Quincy all engage in different ways with these issues, not least the paradoxical quality of the illusion effect brought into play by contemporary visual images. In his entry on illusion in the Encyclopédie, for example, Marmontel sees the pictorial version of theatrical illusion as a semi-illusion, quote, a way of being deceived and not taken in. For Abbé Dubois, the copy of the object should, as it were, excite in us a copy of the feeling that the object itself would have excited. The artificiality of an illusionistic representation and the role played by the spectator in this are highlighted by Quatremer when he writes, should the object of imitation ever be confused with its image, that very confusion, robbing us of our awareness of the imitation, would annihilate both the effect and the pleasure it produces. The devices employed to suggest the ephemeral, which marked such a marked feature of so many 18th century portrait busts, also served to counter criticism of sculpture's lack of movement. And sometimes even a critic as skeptical about sculpture as Diderot could be convinced, as he was in the case of Houdon's statue of the Maréchal de Tourville, albeit evaluating it as a pseudo-painting. Diderot writes, "This figure has movement. The chosen movement is sublime. This is not sculpture. It is a painting. It is a fine Van Dyck." And much the same might have been said of Roubiliac's statue of Handel or his statue of Duncan Forbes. The pleasure and interest of giving 18th century portrait sculpture close and sustained attention lies in its ambiguity. Looking at a portrait bust involves the fiction of looking at a face, but central to this process is an awareness that this face-to-face encounter with a carved marble artifact without colour or movement is indeed a fiction, albeit a pleasurable and absorbing one, depending on the virtuosity with which the illusionistic surfaces are carved. It is this difference which prompts the spectator's pleasurable oscillation, an oscillation between face or image, between flesh or marble, as exemplifying, as it were, Wollheim's twofoldness. It might also be added that the way in which we are alerted to the marble's materiality through the traces of the chisel, prompting us to become vicarious makers, imaginatively reenacting the carving of the marble, is in itself a fiction. This is akin to what Baxendale has observed about in another discussion of that of Chardin, what he has observed about Chardin's tangible paint surfaces, this time drawing on Condiac's ideas about attention. For Baxendale, quote, "The tangible quality of Chardin's paint surfaces is substantially a fiction, not actual but represented, a pictorial representation of tangible texture we think we perceive," unquote. The same might be said of some of the more roughly carved marble surfaces on busts by Roubiliac or Houdon. Now, running through all this discussion of the 18th century bust and statue have been certain assumptions about marble as a material and an implicit contrast with other materials. If marble could be used to create such illusionistic effects, how do these compare with what was possible in wax? While these were in many ways more strikingly realistic, naturalistic, illusionistic, or veristic, whichever term one likes to choose, what is being simulated seems to occlude the material being employed in a way that is not so with the bust. The puzzle of making sense of the relationship between representation and material is tellingly less. The play with perception and the challenge and complexity of twofoldness is missing. By contrast, this sense of the surfaces of marble sculpture and the ways in which these were differentiated was central to the apprehension of 18th century busts and marble busts and statues. Of course, the distinction between surface treatments may be read in a variety of ways. In his analysis of Pigalle's statue of Voltaire on the right, for instance, Hans Kerner has contrasted the rusticity of Pigalle's surfaces with the smooth polish of Bouchardon's Cupid on the left, equating the latter with the refinement of mid-18th century French culture and the former with Rousseau's critique of that refinement. But the point remains that marble surfaces were here being attended to closely. Now, the examples I have used so far represent only a limited range of those types of 18th century sculpture in which illusionism played a significant role. They are also significantly sculptures employing modes of representation that come closest to those used in painting. In some cases, the surfaces of the marble were indeed tinted to enhance the illusionistic and almost painterly effects, as was the case with Roubilliac's monument to Viscount Shannon, which was the tent at the back was tinted in various different hues. But to what extent might we apply either Lockean modes of viewing or Wollheim's notion of twofoldness to a wider range of works in marble? Now, where my account of sculptural viewing runs into problems is with neoclassical sculpture, with its apparently smooth surfaces and ideal forms. Thorvaldsen on the left and Canova on the right. Many of the features I've been describing as necessary in the balance between illusion and material are indeed explicitly condemned by Reynolds in his 10th discourse about sculpture. For Reynolds, quote, picturesque effects, contrasts, or petty excellences are seen as violating sculpture's essential character. Similarly, the sculptor employs the representation of the thing itself, but still as a means to a higher end, as a gradual ascent, always advancing towards faultless form and perfect beauty. Elsewhere, he suggests that the general figure presents itself in a more conspicuous manner than the features. It is there that we must principally look for expression or character. So, following Reynolds, we might understand Thorvaldsen's figures being appreciated by the viewer for their poses and outlines, at least primarily. But as Alex Potts has pointed out, Canova's marbles, and indeed even some of Thorvaldsen's, show a surprising degree of subtle surface working when viewed closely. The twofoldness involved here, then, might be understood as a tension between closely observed appreciation of the surfaces of skin on the one hand, and a perception of the fine gradations of the marble surfaces representing that skin on the other. But this has to be, as it were, seen very close to. Stepping back, we find that this tension is lost. Alternatively, if we see a marble sculpture as the representation of a human figure, perhaps rather than seeing here the operation of twofoldness, a process involving a close and reciprocal relationship between the recognitional and the configurational, and so between illusion and material, we might observe these two components of representational seeing as being consciously split apart. That is to say, the twofoldness that we recognize in the view of painting is here consciously rejected as inappropriate to marble sculpture, or at least neoclassical marble sculpture. Along with Reynolds, we might understand the quality of such sculptures as both material object and representation through their apartness rather than their twofoldness. I'm not sure I've really worked this out, but however we might interpret it, neoclassical sculpture seems to work differently when we attempt to understand it in terms of twofoldness. And this concept makes better sense, I suggest, when we apply it to the 18th century portrait bust. Be that as it may, the debate initiated by Gombrich and his critics, especially Wollheim, seems to me to raise some productive but challenging questions when applied to sculpture. Now, all this is far from straightforward, and at this point, I can only echo Wollheim's somewhat melancholy remark that the most difficult problem of all is how we perceive sculpture. Thank you.